When the stage lights dimmed and the quiet hum of the AGT arena settled into anticipation, a tiny silhouette stepped forward, Darwin, a skinny kid whose oversized jacket looked like it had been borrowed from 3 different thrift stores across Old Sydney Street. His shoes were scuffed, his hair slightly messy, and his hands trembled as he gripped the microphone like it was the only solid thing he had left in the world. His family, who had scraped together whatever coins they could find in their cramped neighborhood they jokingly called Mini Melbourne, sat nervously in the audience, praying that this one shot would change everything. They carried the weight of hardship in their eyes, the kind of struggle that comes from years of surviving in the forgotten edges of a big country, far from the glamour, far from the spotlight, far from the idea that anyone like Darwin could ever stand on a stage this massive. The judges glanced at each other, almost confused by the sight of such a fragile kid walking out with no fancy outfit, no dramatic entrance, no backup dancers, just pure nervous energy. And then there was Simon Cowell. Simon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing that classic expression that screamed, "Here we go again." His eyebrows lifted just enough to show his doubt, and he even let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sigh. It was the kind of poor reaction that every contestant fears, an instant dismissal before they even open their mouth. To him, Darwin looked like just another hopeful kid from nowhere, someone who would probably mumble through a song, get a polite clap, and walk off forgotten. But what Simon didn't realize was that this kid carried something inside him, something powerful, rare, and rooted deep in stories passed down from dusty Australian streets and late-night dreams. Darwin swallowed hard, glanced once at his family, then stepped right into the center of the stage as if gathering courage from every mile they had traveled. He adjusted the microphone, took a shaky breath, and for a moment, the entire arena fell into a silent pause, not the comfortable kind, but the kind where everyone collectively wonders whether this kid will manage to say a single note. Simon's unimpressed stare felt like a weight pressing on Darwin, but instead of breaking him, it pushed him. And then, with a sudden burst of confidence that nobody saw coming, Darwin opened his mouth and released a sound that instantly shattered every assumption in the room. It wasn't just singing, it was a voice that felt resurrected from the golden days of music, a tone so electrifying, so hauntingly familiar that people first froze in shock before leaning forward in disbelief. It was as if Elvis Presley himself had strolled out of Adelaide, stepped into Darwin's small frame, and decided to give AGT one more performance for the ages. The richness of his tone, the old-school vibrato, the emotional grit that came pouring out, it all crashed into the arena like a tidal wave. Even the camera crew members from the backstage area they called Little Perth stopped moving, stunned by the transformation happening right in front of them. The audience gasped. The judges blinked rapidly. And Simon, despite every effort to hide it, jerked upright in his seat, his eyes widening just a fraction too much to stay neutral. For the first time that night, his mask cracked. Because this poor kid from a forgotten corner of Australia wasn't just singing. He was reviving a legend, commanding the stage with the presence of someone far beyond his years. Darwin didn't just surprise the room, he shook it to its core. As Darwin powered into the heart of the song, everything about his performance transformed from a shaky beginning into a full-blown musical eruption. His voice didn't just fill the stage, it took ownership of it. Every note carried the warm swagger of Perth, bold and confident, as if he had walked straight off a coastal stage and onto a global platform. Then came the soulful tenderness of Sydney, flowing through his vibrato with a depth that felt impossibly rich for someone his age. And in the high notes, the raw, gritty fire of Hobart came alive, a sound forged from struggle, persistence, and nights spent practicing in tiny rooms where the walls were too thin and life was too loud. Each Australian city lived in his voice, blending into something stunning, something iconic. The audience could feel it. The judges could feel it. The entire theater vibrated with the sense that they weren't witnessing a kid with talent, they were witnessing a kid with destiny. People in the audience began rising out of their chairs almost instantly, as if pulled up by the force of Darwin's voice. Rows from what fans affectionately called Little Brisbane and North Canberra Row erupted with cheers that rolled through the whole arena. Some audience members stood with their hands over their mouths, unable to process that this small, nervous kid could channel a voice powerful enough to resurrect an era. It wasn't just singing, it was storytelling, time-traveling, and soul-bearing all at once. Even backstage, seasoned crew members who had seen thousands of auditions froze in their tracks. Cameras stopped drifting. Headphones were pulled off. People leaned toward the stage as if gravity itself was being rewritten by Darwin's voice. But up on the judges' panel sat Simon Cowell, the one unmoved face in a sea of stunned reactions. His pen clicked sharply against the desk as he studied Darwin like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. His reaction stayed cold, almost harsh, like he was determined not to let this kid get an inch of approval. While the other judges exchanged glances that practically screamed, "This is something special," Simon remained rigid, arms folded tight across his chest. Every judge on AGT knows that when Simon folds his arms, it usually means he doubts everything happening in front of him. Yet the truth was written all over him, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the way he tilted his head, the quick tension in his jaw, these were the micro-reactions that betrayed him. Because even though Simon wanted to keep his poor reaction, to act as if Darwin was just another audition, the performance was too strong, too authentic, too electrifying to ignore. But instead of showing admiration, Simon did what Simon does best. He tried to keep control. He locked himself behind that classic unimpressed facade, refusing to give Darwin the satisfaction of a smile or a nod. Still, Darwin didn't need Simon's approval to keep going. The more Simon tried to stay cold, the stronger Darwin grew. His voice soared higher, richer, more explosive with every lyric, feeding off the roar of the crowd. He began moving with confidence, subtly swaying like a young Elvis, channeling that unmistakable rhythm that had once shaken American stages in the 1950s. The music built, filling every inch of the arena, and even Simon couldn't escape the pull of it. His foot tapped once, barely noticeable, but enough for millions watching on TV to screenshot later and say, "Caught you, Simon." By the midpoint of the song, it was undeniable, Darwin wasn't just performing, he was dominating. He was rewriting the story of what a kid from a poor Australian corner could do. And while Simon Cowell sat there fighting his own amazement, the rest of the theater had already surrendered to the magic. By the time Darwin reached the final note, a massive, soaring, spine-shaking note that ripped through the arena like a tidal wave rolling in from the Gold Coast, the entire AGT theater erupted into absolute chaos. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was an explosion, the kind of reaction that only happens when people realize they just witnessed a once-in-a-generation moment. Audience members from South Sydney Row leapt to their feet, shouting his name. A group from East Adelaide Lane waved their hands wildly, tears streaming down their faces. Even the balcony levels, where people usually stay seated, began shaking from the stomping, cheering, and chanting that filled the space. It felt like someone had flipped a switch and suddenly turned the theater into a sold-out concert from the golden age of rock and roll. Darwin stood frozen for a moment, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. His eyes scanned the room, everywhere he looked, people were cheering, crying, screaming, pulling out their phones, hugging strangers. He had walked onto that stage as a nervous kid from a poor neighborhood in a forgotten corner of Australia, but he was standing there now like someone who had just brought a legend back from the dead. It felt unreal, like a dream unfolding in slow motion. But it was real. Every scream. Every applause. Every stunned expression. All for him. The judges rose one by one. Sophia stood first, clapping with both hands above her head. Heidi followed, cheering loud enough for the entire front row to hear her over the noise. Howie punched the air with a gleeful grin. But then came Simon, slow, deliberate, unwilling. He stood last, and not with excitement, but with the stiff posture of someone forced to admit the undeniable. He still wore that tight-lipped expression, the one that tried to say, "It wasn't that great," but everyone in the theater knew he was bluffing. His reaction was still cold, still guarded, still trying to maintain control. But even behind Simon's poker face, there was something different, something shaken. The twitch in his lip, the slight widening of his eyes, the almost hidden nod he tried to smother, they all told the truth. Darwin had gotten to him. And the crowd saw it. They pointed. They laughed. They shouted, "You can't hide it, Simon." The entire theater seemed to know they had just witnessed Simon Cowell get blindsided in real time, not by fireworks, not by stage tricks, but by a kid with nothing but a voice strong enough to echo through decades. Simon's poor reaction didn't matter anymore. It was part of the moment, proof that Darwin had shaken the show's toughest critic to his core. As the noise continued, Darwin's family from mini Melbourne ran toward the stage, tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by pride and disbelief. Crew members backstage, those from Little Perth, South Brisbane Corner, and Canberra Hallway, applauded him with respect usually reserved only for superstars. The judges eventually sat down, but the crowd didn't. They kept roaring, chanting Darwin's name, pushing the energy higher and higher as if refusing to let the moment end. Darwin finally smiled, a wide, stunned, emotional smile that told the whole world he had just lived the biggest moment of his life. He didn't just sing. He didn't just impress. He revived an era, resurrected a style, and proved that sometimes the most powerful voices rise from the most unlikely places. This poor kid from Australia didn't just win the night. He made history.